Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Successful Grant Applications for Your Church During COVID-19 and Beyond. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. My name is Richard Coleman and I'm the Managing Director for UK General Insurance here at Ecclesiastical. I'd like to welcome you to this, our fourth fundraising webinar. As you can see, I'm working from home, as virtually all of our colleagues have been since March 2020. And I'm pleased to say that in these unusual circumstances, we've continued to provide our usual high level of service and claims and underwriting expertise. However, we do understand that now more than ever, there's an immediate need to look beyond insurance and risk management and funding to meet the day-to-day needs for your church and communities is becoming a more urgent and more pressing issue than it ever has done before. This webinar is presented in collaboration with fundraising specialists Philanthropy Company. For the past 18 years, they've worked with a range of organisations and charities, particularly in the faith, church and heritage sectors. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Caroline Underwood, OBE. Caroline is a senior leader and an expert in fundraising. She has over 30 years experience in the field, and she's worked at the highest levels with chiefs of industry and government leaders, as well as her local church in Oxfordshire. We're also delighted to be joined by Jeremy Knowles. Jeremy is Grant and Relationship Manager at All Churches Trust, and he'll be sharing insights from the grant funder's perspective. So before I hand over to Caroline, I have a few housekeeping items I just need to cover. So firstly, all the guidance in this webinar is applicable at the time of recording. As I'm sure you'll understand, due to the unusual circumstances we find ourselves in, we can't guarantee all statements will remain correct in the future. So much is just fast moving right now. Secondly, at the end of the session, there will be time for you to ask Caroline any questions you may have. And if you do want to submit a question, all you have to do is enter your name, details, and questions in the box underneath the video, and that'll be entitled Ask a Question. Finally, if you do miss anything, don't worry. We'll be sending around a link to the recording afterwards so you can watch it back at any time. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Caroline Underwood from the Philanthropy Company. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Richard, very much for that introduction. And I'm delighted to talk to you today about successful grants fundraising. There's lots of opportunities for churches, even in today's climate, to raise funds for projects and for activities. And this webinar is going to look at some of the opportunities around that. We're going to look at the grant funding landscape in the UK. We're going to have quite a close look at what do grant funders support. Talk about where to look for funding, how to identify potential funders, and then importantly, look at what you might put in your application. What is the best practice in writing winning applications? So first of all, who is a grant funder? What is a grant funder? Well, typically it's a trust or foundation. It might be a public funder, such as a national lottery. It might be a government funder, such as the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, or might be a particular foundation, like a community foundation. There are around 9,000 charitable trusts and foundations in the UK alone that award grants, and their funding comes from private sources, such as family or corporate wealth. And many of those are actually spending the interest on their overall investments so that they can support a philanthropic programme. In the main, although there are a number of different funders, in the main, we have found that grant funding for churches comes from trusts and foundations, and some public funders like the Heritage Fund. So what's been happening with COVID-19? Well, in response to the COVID-19 crisis, many grant funders launched emergency funding programs earlier in the year. Some of these still exist, but many of them are starting to close. And funders are shifting their focus to resilience grants, or what they're calling building back grants. Many of them want to support the most vulnerable in society, and for churches this means there's opportunities to apply for funding the projects that you run. In fact, in many ways, the impact of COVID-19 has underlined the importance of the church's mission in support of the local community. Grant funders that are still offering emergency grants are, in the main, about funding projects for community projects, community engagement, and of course for public benefit. So what areas of grants do funders support? There's a wide range of interests, and you'll find that lots of people cite their areas of interest in slightly different ways. But what we've done here is group together a number of areas that you might think about. And we're just going to spend a little bit of time thinking about how they apply to you and your church. A list of the typical areas of interest are: many funders support mental health and well-being, particularly during COVID times. Many people are interested in youth work and engaging local youngsters. Of course, more broadly, community support, or there might be heritage support for a particular aspect, not only of the fabric of the church, but actually the heritage of the local community. The environment is clearly on people's minds. And then there are specific capital projects. There are some funders that will support specific capital projects. For example, there are some funders that will only support restoration of organs. So let's have a look at how your church might be able to fit within some of those areas of interest. You have to be a little bit imaginative here, and you have to think about your projects and how they relate to some of these particular areas of interest. For example, mental health and well-being could cover a large number of projects, but it might be that you're already supporting elderly, isolated people, and clearly that's about people's well-being. It might be you're supporting a friendship network or home visits run by volunteers. I think everyone's become super aware during COVID-19 of the importance of supporting our communities and the role that the church plays in mobilizing people to do that. There may be a focus on young people. Now, often that's about thinking about opportunities for young people, but it may even be about involving young people in volunteering, in connecting with their own community. And that may go on to thinking about community initiatives. Many communities have set up food banks or meal clubs or just simply social clubs for people. Heritage is slightly more obvious, usually the repair of a historic fabric. But usually people want, some funders want the community to be involved in that repair. For example, if you were restoring the churchyard, it'd be terrific to be able to show how volunteers have been involved in that work, both practically and in terms of supporting it more generally. The environment might range from being a community garden or actually being in the locale where you have environmental projects around you. And of course, capital projects might be about installing new facilities. Many churches are interested in installing loos and kitchens, and there is some funding available for this. So it's worth thinking through what projects you have and what areas of interest they might support. I'm really delighted that as part of this webinar, we're being joined by somebody who gives out grants all the time. It's terrific that Jeremy Knowles is able to join us to talk to you. The interesting thing about Jeremy is, of course, he runs the Grants at All Churches Trust. He also, earlier in his career, was in financial IT and is an ordained minister in the Church of England, so is incredibly well qualified to talk to us about how All Churches Trust work.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I'd like to start by just briefly describing 4 of All Churches Trust's grants programs that churches can apply to. So first of all, we have our general grants program, through which we make grants for capital projects, so that's buildings and equipment. And those grants can support the repair and restoration and reordering of churches of many denominations, and especially where those changes support wider community use and help those in need. Secondly, we have our Roof Protection Scheme grants program, and that provides grants to help churches install roof alarms in response to the issue of metal theft, which sadly continues to be a very challenging issue across the UK. Thirdly, our Growing Lives grants program, which aims to support churches to connect with children and young people in their communities through funding the adaptation of buildings and provision of equipment. And then fourthly, our Hope Beyond grants program. We've launched that very recently in response to the coronavirus pandemic. And through Hope Beyond, we want to help churches and Christian charities to meet the changing needs within their communities as a result of COVID-19, helping them and the communities they support to adapt to changes and opportunities presented by the pandemic. Let's look in a bit more detail at Growing Lives. So we launched Growing Lives in 2019, and we wanted, through this programme, to provide more specific funding to help churches engage better with children and young people in their communities. We believe that churches have a key role to play in responding to the challenges that children and young people face. helping to improve their lives, encouraging them to explore faith and to play an increasing part in their church and local community. And we recognise that inadequate buildings and poor equipment can be a real barrier to helping churches do all they want to in this area. Now, one church that benefited through a Growing Lives grant was St Edward's in Runcorn, Cheshire. Their project was called Our Space, and they wanted to transform a bare and unused room in their parish centre into a vibrant, inviting space for the young people of their parish to help meet their social, physical and emotional needs, and spiritual needs too. And the church engaged with young people locally to find out more about what they wanted and explained in their application how it was they planned to use this new space to run activities that would improve young people's self-esteem and confidence, develop their leadership skills, help them with their mental health, and combat the influence of gangs, drugs and crime, which were big issues in the area, and also to help them grow in faith and to run their own social action projects, particularly for older people in their community. It sounded like a great project to us, but importantly, the church told us not only what they plan to do, but also how they plan to monitor and evaluate the impact of what they plan to do. We were really excited by their vision, and so we awarded a grant of nearly £7,000 towards the £11,000 cost of the project. Now, we'd love to receive more applications for Growing Lives, so if you've got a project that fits the programme criteria, we'd love you to get in touch and tell us all about it, and we'd love to see how we can help. And then to say a bit more about Hope Beyond. We all know that the world has been turned upside down by the coronavirus pandemic, and there's been a massive impact on all of us and on our communities. So we decided to launch a new grants programme specifically to help churches to respond to the ongoing challenges and opportunities presented by the pandemic. To begin with, though, we carried out a survey among churches to better understand what they felt the key needs of people of all ages in their own communities would be as the longer term impact of COVID-19 becomes clearer. And as a result of that research and that survey, through Hope Beyond, we want to support projects that address three key themes: the issues of loneliness and isolation, community resilience and mental and emotional health and well-being, and then digital capability and provision. Now, Hope Beyond is still very new. We've only launched it in the last few weeks, so we've not made any grants yet, but the first wave of applications is being considered by our trustees soon. Now, we've been really impressed by the range of applications we've received, projects that demonstrate how churches of all sizes and in all sorts of situations have really thought carefully about what they can do to support people in their communities. Through things like making their buildings COVID safe, improving technology to provide more help and support online to people that might be cut off and isolated, and some applications for some really imaginative projects that have shown us how churches have understood the particular challenges in their communities and come up with some really creative ways of responding. Now, because we haven't awarded any grants yet through Hope Beyond, I can't give you any specific examples just yet, but we do look forward to doing so soon on our website. Now, demand has been really strong for Hope Beyond, so if your church has a project for which you'd like to apply, then I would encourage you to get in touch and put an application in as soon as you possibly can. Finally, a brief example of one of our more general grants, and this is from St Margaret's Church in Streatham in South London, which serves the community with a wide range of social issues. Now, St Margaret's had dwindled to less than 20 people and was under threat of closure. But the church was relaunched with a new vision to maximise use of the building, to develop relevant and vibrant spaces to support identified local needs that would benefit local residents, and to reopen the church as a sustainable community hub which can be accessed by all, but with a primary focus of addressing the needs of the local community. Now, we really like the way that the church had consulted with other local charities, with statutory bodies and local residents and other stakeholders in formulating their plan. It was a great example of wider community engagement. And they then told us in their application how they wanted to adapt their building so that they could respond to what they discovered and provide support to people struggling with food poverty, people in need of help with debt and mental health issues, young people, ex-offenders, and older people who were just in need of some social contact. And so we were really glad to support their project with a grant of £23,000. Well, I hope that's been helpful in explaining why All Churches Trust likes to award grants that help to build communities. And you can find out more details about our grants programmes and how to apply, and also access a wide range of resource and advices on our website, which you can find at www.allchurches.co.uk. Thank you very much for listening, and back to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let's turn then to where to look for funding. And I do want to advise you that there is lots of information on Ecclesiastical's Church Fundraising Hub, so do take a look at that. There's also a number of other sources of information, some of which you will have seen already, some of which are a little bit overwhelming, but we have listed a number of ideas of where to look here. So the Church Fundraising Hub on Ecclesiastical's website. There are lots of free places to look, such as the Heritage Funding Directory, and there are others where you might need to subscribe. And don't forget, within your own diocese, you can ask for support from stewardship and fundraising officers where they exist. It's worth looking on the Church of England website, of course, but often sources of support might be through word of mouth. It's sometimes worth talking to people in other churches, finding out who's supported them, or as you visit other churches, have a look at who has supported them. There's a wide range of potential supporters, and we've alluded to some of them here. We'd certainly give you some websites to look at, but often it's a case of looking around and just keeping your eyes open as well. What we've found is that there is a lot of information and it can be a little bit overwhelming. So it's really, really helpful to try and focus where you want to look. And researching your possible funders does take a bit of time, but it's so worthwhile. It's not worthwhile just sending out a bunch of letters and applications to people that are basically just going to say no. It's really worth putting your research in and focusing where you put your time and effort. We've put together here a simple grid to help you organize your research, and this will help you narrow down how you want to approach particular funders. So it's reasonably self-explanatory, but looking at this from the left to the right, you might have identified a trust. Let's take the AN Other Trust. What type of trust is it? Oh, it's run by a family. It's a family trust. There might be families on the board. Their areas of interest will often be on their website, but not always, but usually on their website. Have a look at what they've given to in the past. This will be in their annual report, or they may say very openly on their website, our grants range from £1,000 to £5,000. Who are the key people? Does anyone know any of them? And most importantly, what is the procedure that they request? It is important to look at that because often trusts and foundations have said to me how irritating it is and people try and bypass the approach or bypass the system. So do have a look at what they ask for. Some people may ask for a general application first, an expression of interest. Some people may ask to be telephoned, but do have a look and do follow that procedure because it is important to work in with what they ask for. There may be some other things to think about. Perhaps the grants manager is a member of the church. Perhaps somebody else knows one of the trustees. These can be very helpful links into a particular funder. Have a think about how much you want to ask for. It's no good asking somebody like this top trust who traditionally give around £3,000 to local charities. It's no good asking them for £50,000, but it just won't even get looked at. So do think about what you're going to ask them for. And then it is worth getting in touch before making an actual application to confirm your eligibility. Most people, unless they say, please do not approach us, most people will take an email just setting out your project and asking if they should make a formal application. So you will want to create your own grid, but what we've given you here is a formula that you can use to narrow down and focus who you might approach. Similarly, we were thinking about, well, how do you decide who's the most useful person to go to? And there's another chart here, another grid here, which we thought would be useful for you, and particularly useful when there's a number of people involved in fundraising. Perhaps you've put together a fundraising committee. Perhaps you've got local volunteers. So setting out a simple table to rate your potential funders is really useful. And this will help you to order which trusts you consider a priority when you go about writing applications. As you can see, each category has a score of up to 5 points. There are 4 categories, so the total potential score is 20. And the example we've put here is the Rose Tree Foundation, who in this formula we've scored 14. And you know then that approaching them is probably more of a priority than approaching the AN Other Trust. We've talked a little bit about areas of interest. Again, this refers to the kind of causes, projects or programs that a funder supports. For example, youth projects, health, well-being. And do remember that health also applies to mental health. So do think about programs that you're running that actually are for the benefit of people's mental health, which can include hope and loneliness and isolation. So do think about health in its broadest sense. Geography is important. Most trusts will say which areas they cover. And if you're approaching somebody very specific to your area, clearly there is a strength in having that geographical connection, but important to look at that, otherwise you will be wasting your time. Some trusts say they don't support religious or Christian projects. Obviously, important to look at that. That doesn't disqualify you from applying, however. It might disqualify you from applying for particular faith-driven projects, but it wouldn't disqualify you from applying for a community-facing project or something which makes a strong prospect along the lines of the areas the trust is interested in. And as I mentioned before, do you have any kind of connection to a trustee or the grant manager? Ideal if they live locally and know your community and your church. So let's turn then to, you've identified to who you want to approach. Let's turn then to how do you approach them? What is the best practice in writing applications? How do you write in a compelling way to attract someone's attention, bearing in mind that many of these trusts get literally hundreds of applications a day? One of the big trusts that we work with has told me they have more than 1,000 applications a week. So it is worth really honing your writing skills and thinking about your message. As we've touched on, every funder has their own criteria. So although you can obviously reuse your budget, reuse your message, you will need to tailor your approaches appropriately. And many trusts ask you to apply a particular stage in your project. For example, for a capital project, some specifically say, do not apply until planning permission is in place. Others will say, please apply as early as possible so that we understand the opportunity around your project. For community projects, you may be asked to evidence the need or the rationale behind your project. Your diocese may well have statistics about the need in your area, and there's something called the indices of deprivation, which is a useful source to refer to, demonstrating the need and perhaps the gaps in provision in your area. You may also be asked to talk about other charities you're working with locally. Many funders like to see collaboration with other charities, maybe even with other faith groups, both Christian and other. All of these strengthen your project and show that you are looking to really engage the community and think as broadly and strategically as you can. And if you're watching this and you have a major building project, a major capital project, you might be asked to provide information around the professional staff that have been involved in it, the architect, who's looking at the planning, who's on the capital fundraising committee. And it's useful to look at some of the big funders if you're applying to those, like the National Lottery Heritage Fund, NLHF, about their requirements for applications. In fact, having a look at their application guidance is really useful for most big funders because it sort of sets out what big funders are looking for. So what do you include in your application? The most important piece is really to talk about your vision. Why are you running this project? Why do you need to make this application? Underpinning successful grant applications is an inspiring vision, or what I think of as a story, an inspiring story. This might be something that your wider church or diocese already are working within, but it should be appealing and easily understood by a funder. You need to be able to understand how your project fits into your wider thinking. If you don't already have a vision written down that outlines your mission, outlines the church mission, it would be a good time to do that. Doesn't need to be a long or complicated document. It can just be a paragraph. But the important thing is to be very clear about why your project is important to your church. And of course, you don't want to change that every time you make an application. You want to have something that's broad enough that you can fit your church in that overall vision every time you make an application. And it can tie in with the wider 5 marks of mission which are within the church. So we particularly like this one and wanted to share it with you. St John's in Hackney has a very short and simple vision. Our vision is to bring hope to the heart of East London. I think that says it all, doesn't it? It's about mission, it's about community, it's about the future, it's about looking forward. You won't want to have the same, but it's a very short and succinct and powerful vision. So thinking about the application, you've set out the vision. What are the other things that you might want to include? Each funder will have their own application criteria, as we've said, but there will be some typical questions asked. Why do you need your project? What difference will it make? Who's going to benefit? The timing, when will it take place? And critically, what will the outcomes be? What difference will it make? How are you going to address that? Well, again, you will want to interpret this as appropriate for your church and your project, but some ideas here, some examples for you here. So for example, what is the need for your project? The answer might be, we have a high number of low-income families in our community and we really wish to support them. What will you deliver? What is the crux of your project? In this example, it's a food bank every Wednesday to support 100 local families with a weekly supply of grocery. Very practical, very clear, very focused on what you want to achieve. Who will benefit, be involved? Families within the parish, town, local area, people with school-aged children, and young people volunteering to help run the project will be provided with skills to help them find jobs and develop their work experience after leaving school. And what's interesting there is it's very focused on who are the direct beneficiaries, the families, but there's also secondary beneficiaries, the youngsters who are helping to actually deliver the project. So worth thinking through what's the kind of core deliverable and also then who else is going to benefit. When is it going to take place? Every week, every Wednesday, from January to May 2021. Be as specific as you can. And what will the outcomes be? Well, the outcomes will be families will be fed, children will be fed, they'll be able to study all the other wider benefits around children having a square meal. Parents will be supported to care for their families, and probably there are some soft outcomes as well, such as the social contact and the hope and the encouragement that a simple parcel of local groceries, of groceries to local families will make. We've just tried to give an example there of how you might be very factual, but also show what difference your project will make and humanize it as well. Talk about the people that will benefit and indeed the people delivering the project. I've mentioned before how many applications trusts and foundations receive in a week. And I want to talk to you about when people say no. I've been a fundraiser for nearly 3 decades and I've had a lot of no's. And it is important to think about that because many people that we work with say, I applied to XYZ Trust, they said no, I'm never going to talk to them again. That's not the right approach, if I may say so. Being positive, keeping going, asking is really important. After all, if you don't ask, you're clearly not going to get. It may feel very daunting if you've put a lot of work into applying for a grant and then there's a no, or for a major capital project like the National Lottery Heritage Fund, can be incredibly dispiriting. But you must keep in mind that there are many, many projects and these funders are there to support the greater good of society. Grants fundraising can yield great results. Sometimes grants from trusts and foundations form the biggest donation within your fundraising campaign. And what's more, once you've established a relationship with a grant funder, you might find they support you again. So you can get many no's before you get a yes, but I assure you this is completely normal. You really need to keep going. And just to give you some context, in the larger charity world, beyond churches that send multiple grant applications, they actually usually work on a 10% yes rate. So it is worth not only doing your research, but also steeling yourself to keeping going. An application to a well-researched grant funder is never a waste. They might come back and comment on why your application isn't strong enough, which will help you with others. Or actually it will help every time you write one, it will help your application to become stronger. So let's talk about different kinds of no's. The way people say no is very different, but the way people respond to a grant saying no is also different as well. You need to watch out for that. If a funder comes back and says, thank you for application, we're not supporting it, but you look like a wonderful organisation, a wonderful church, have a look at what else they might fund that's relevant to your church or project. Have a look at whether actually you asked in a slightly, maybe you asked for too much, or maybe your time frame was wrong. But if they say, no, not for this, immediately think, right, what might they be good for? A no, not unless is really helpful. Because if they come back and say, no, we're not going to support you, but if this project were happening in 2022, we would, that is super helpful, because it may be that that unless is something you can change. A no, not now. It is worth asking them when you can make another application. If somebody writes to you and says, we appreciated your application, but it's a no, it is worth sometimes, it depends on whether it's a detailed letter or whether it's just a kind of straight email, no form response. Sometimes worth writing and just saying, thank you for considering it. Please keep us in touch with other deadline dates. Similarly, no too much. You may have asked for too much money. Most of the trusts that we work with, if people ask for too much money, they will guide people and say, you don't fit into our over £30,000 category, but we will look at you in the £10,000 to £12,000 category. Again, incredibly helpful. Most managers in trusts and foundations are motivated by the difference they can make and are out to be helpful. And if they're not, it's usually just to do with the sheer volume of applications that they're handling with. So do be polite as you would be, and do be inclusive, and do tell them about your project, because they will be interested, even if they don't have the time to respond in any great detail. A no, never, please don't contact us is fairly clear, but at least you can take them off your list of people to be approaching. And no, sometimes people launch a particular opportunity to apply. So a particular window where they might say you can apply for funding, and often people are just overwhelmed. So you may not be successful in that round, but you may be successful in another round. You will think of more no's, but unless it's a really firm no, do think of what you can learn from each no and how you can therefore improve your chances with them next time, or indeed with another. So I hope you found that useful. What we have tried to do is to cover the grant funding landscape in the UK, have a detailed look at what grant funders support, where to look for funding, and I do remind you that there is information on the Ecclesiastical Fundraising Hub, and also to touch on best practice in writing applications, giving you some tips about the kinds of responses grant funders will expect in response to typical questions. That is a framework, that is some useful tips. Of course, every situation is slightly different, but if I can leave you with thinking about the importance of being really clear about your project, the importance of setting out your vision and then describing the project in it to maximize your best chances for funding. And I'm delighted now to invite you to ask some questions and to talk to you a bit further about the opportunities for church funding.
Thank you, Caroline, for sharing your insights and for that overview of grants and trust fundraising. I really hope that everyone watching found it helpful and you picked up some useful tips. My name is Catherine Keeper. I'm the fundraising coordinator at Ecclesiastical, and I'm delighted to now have the opportunity to pass some of your questions on to Caroline to answer live in the moment. And so I'd like to jump into the first question, Caroline. which we're really grateful to have received from St James the Great in Cornwall, so thank you for that. And they ask, can we still apply for projects based on plans and ideas pre-COVID-19? And if not, what advice can you give?
Thank you, Catherine. No, you can certainly still apply. I think the sensible thing to do would be to update the outcomes for the local community. Obviously, funders will be thinking, well, how does your project address what are ongoing needs from COVID-19? Given it's going to be something that's here to stay for at least some time, how will your project support people outside of your congregation, but in the local community that may have been hit by the virus? So by all means still apply, but do contextualize it in today's world in the context of COVID.
Brill, thank you, Caroline, and I hope that Caroline's response was helpful. Really interesting questions here about financial reserves and applying for grants. We have a question from All Saints in Sidmouth who ask, do grant funders take into account the financial reserves held by a church? And St John's in Eldenham have asked, if you have reserves put aside for emergencies, would this be detrimental to a grant application?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The straight answer is be absolutely transparent. And yes, of course, grant funders do take into account reserves. Having some reserves is not a bad thing because funders want to see that you're sustainable and have some reserves to fall back on. But if you have major reserves for a rainy day, they may well ask, well, why aren't you using those for your project? Why are you coming to us when you perhaps have some reserves you can use? The best answer, if you do have significant reserves, is to actually allocate some of them to the project. And then you can say to the funder, look, we've already put this much of our reserves in, and now we're asking for this much. So yes, the answer is absolutely, people do take into account reserves. And also important to have reserves policy just written down, even if it's just a couple of lines, so that you can share that with funders about your intention around what scale of reserves you intend to build up.
Great, thank you, Caroline. That was really helpful. A really interesting question here from the Church of Good Shepherd, Kirk Sandal and Eden Thorpe, and they ask, what are the main sources of funding for churches that are 40 years old and carry no listed or historic building status?
So it's a good one because, of course, there are lots of modern churches, and inevitably you're not eligible for some of the heritage grants. However, if you're looking at your improvements to the building or the role of your church and community, it is about placing it in a bigger project. So to give you some examples, there are grants from the National Churches Trust. There are grants from the various landfill communities, including the Landfill Communities Fund. Somebody like the Trust House Charitable Foundation or other community foundations. There's quite a few trusts and foundations who will support you. But again, it's important to position your church as part of the community, as part of your project, rather than perhaps dwell on the building. Unless it has some incredible architectural or artistic element, it's the importance of the church as part of the community that you want to be thinking about.
Great, thank you. And the next question we've got coming in was from St Andrews in Ham, so thank you for your question. And they ask, do grant funding trusts for churches focus more on capital projects, or are there grants available to help fund current day-to-day costs also?
Yes, the answer to both is yes. I mean, capital projects are sort of easier to package and perhaps easier to talk about. However, there are grants for ongoing support. It is difficult to achieve grants for what you might call core costs. Somebody asked me the other day about the costs of paying for their electricity. But if you think about it as part of the ongoing costs, then there are potential funders. And to give you some examples, National Churches Trust, very, very good and generous funder, and they have both capital and project grants. In a way, it's similar to what I said before. Many funders and trusts and foundations want to see how the project supports the community, whether it's a capital element or not. So the answer to your question is yes, there are people that support projects as well as capital projects.
Great, and I hope that was helpful to answer your question. The next question is from St. Peter's Church in Ropley. Thank you. And they ask, can you advise on the size of grant requested? Is asking for the moon possibly counterproductive?
I mean, this is a really hard one, isn't it? How much do you ask for? Certainly in the information on the Fundraising Hub, you can see quite a lot of guidance around that. What you should certainly do is say how much your whole project will cost. And then you have to think about the size of the grant requested. So as we've said, or as we've advised on the Fundraising Hub, there are ways of working this out. Some funders are very clear about the scale of grants that you should request. Some are set a limit or say that you fall within a particular bracket. But my guidance would be absolutely cost the whole project and then think about how much is in there. In terms of asking for the moon, you can get it wrong by asking for too much. That can make funders think, well, why isn't anybody else funding this as well? So I think you need to show the full cost of the project and then say what you're asking for from the funder.
Thanks, Caroline. That's really helpful. And our next question that we've just had come in is from St. Nicholas's Church, Kenilworth, who ask, are funds available for projects already commenced?
Yes. Like all things, it slightly depends. If the project has perhaps got phases, you can then actually look for phases, look to fund the next phase. But be aware of how long it takes a funder to make a decision. During COVID, when there are lots of emergency grants around, people were making decisions very quickly. But now people are perhaps, falling back into the more established ways of funding. Do be aware how long it can take, and it's not unusual for a funder to take anything between sort of 3 to 9 months to make a decision on a grant.
Great, thanks, Caroline. We've had quite a few questions on this topic, and it's quite a popular one around grants for repairs, particularly around improving heating, and a few churches looking to improve accessibility needs. So please could you share some of your insights into applying for grants for repairs like this? So heating improvements, improving the building for accessibility. Where can churches look to find those grants and how best can they go about applying for those?
Yes, so accessibility, there are some trusts and foundations that will support accessibility, for example, making a path more accessible or even installing a disabled toilet, for example. So there are some that will specifically do that. However, the other part of the question is about repairs, and it's quite unusual to get grants for repairs unless, again, you're able to put it into the context of why it's important to keep the church repaired and in a good state. Repairs and conservation and heritage you might want to think of all together, because then you're actually looking at specific grants around supporting the capital element of the church.
Thank you, Caroline. We've got an interesting question here about match funding. And this church asks, would the matching of funding generally be based on raising new funds? So, for example, would a funder match existing unrestricted funds, or would they only match kind of new funds raised in a campaign?
Yes, so most people will pledge match funds because they want to help you to raise more. And actually donors, love a matched fund. It can be great incentive to give more. What you can do, though, is you're absolutely making the case for why people support your church. So you can say, we've raised this much ourselves. We've exhausted perhaps the congregation, perhaps people who live locally, and that's why we're now going out for funding. But it's, as far as I'm aware, it's quite unusual for match funds to come into existing funds.
Thanks, Caroline. And we've had a couple of questions around looking for funds and applying for grants, as churches are now streaming their services online or looking to new technologies like Zoom. Could you give us a bit of insights into how funders are responding to this and where churches can look for funds in this area?
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it, when we're all living our lives on Zoom, and I'm not seeing immediate response from people supporting that. I think you need to think about it as communications and outreach, and then you're looking at ways of getting support from the traditional funders. I haven't seen anyone launch something around, the fact that we're all working online specifically. But if you look at it through the lens of addressing isolation, addressing inclusion, perhaps loneliness, then there is funding available. So I would kind of invert that question and say, how can we continue our outreach? How can we continue to engage people, even though we're all living in a virtual world? And that's where I would apply for funding rather than specifically around the Zoom piece, particularly as actually doing virtual communications is quite inexpensive. So it's perhaps difficult to build a case for that. So I would think about it as part of your outreach and addressing loneliness and isolation.
Thanks, Caroline. That's really interesting, looking at it through that different lens. We've got a question here from a cathedral who have a major project that's currently on hold, and they would like your insights into how long it will be before grant funders are ready to address these large projects again.
Yes, I mean, it's if you'd asked me that a month ago, I probably would have said not long, but obviously given we're facing an ongoing challenge with COVID-19, and indeed with different rules and regulations, it still might be a bit longer. Mm-hmm. My advice would be very strongly to not give up, but very strongly to perhaps start talking to potential major funders, and actually to flag that project is coming along and is still is something that they will be going out for. Specifically, the National Lottery Heritage Fund have said that they'll be opening their normal heritage grants again in spring next year, which feels quite a long way away, but actually by the time you get all the information together, it may, it's not that far. And they still have some open funding that you might be eligible for, like something called the Green Horizon grants. The deadline for that is actually very soon. It's actually in October, and the grant range I think is around £250,000. But it is obviously around greening, so it might be around tree planting or something. But the National Lottery Heritage Fund reopening next year is an important one to remember. I also want to make the point that although many trusts and foundations have made changes in response to COVID and actually launched a huge number of emergency grants, many are still continuing with funding their capital projects. So it's very much worth doing the research, even though perhaps the focus of a trust might be on COVID emergency response. Many of them are thinking about their major projects as well. So if you are a very big project or a cathedral, it's absolutely worth looking at the potential funders. And even if they're not ready now, perhaps at least getting yourself on their radar that you will be ready towards the end of the year and early next year.
Thanks, Caroline. And I hope that Caroline's response there was helpful to you. We've just got time for a couple more questions. And we've had a few churches asking for advice as they have very small congregations. A particular church said they have an average congregation of 3 to 5 people. Could you give advice about generally how to fundraise a small congregation, but also when applying for grants, how to approach that and address that?
Well, this is something I actually know very well from my own community. I've lived in 2 small communities where I think the congregation in my last one was about 12, and the congregation in my current one is probably about between 8 and 20. So not quite as small as yours, but still select, shall we say. There are grants available. So there's a few things to look at. One is your church the only community space in the village or in the area? If it is, then actually have a look at how many people are using it beyond the congregation. For example, is there ever a Sunday school, or is there ever somebody using the church for a meeting, a community meeting? because actually you're building a picture of how important the church building is, albeit having a small congregation. So that's one aspect. And then you can look at potential funding for community projects or indeed for capital projects. The other thing that I've learned over the years is that although the congregation may be very small and may indeed be very generous, you may find that there are many people who live geographically nearby who are passionate about the church but are not part of the congregation, and would very much like it to be there and would very much like to support it. So that group of people, even if you only see them at perhaps Christmas and Easter, are a very important group, and it is worth thinking about people beyond the congregation who may support the church. I hope that's helpful. It's quite a tough question when the congregation is really small, but actually if you look a bit further, you may find that there are lots of other supporters as well.
Thanks, Caroline, and I hope that gives a bit of confidence to maybe churches who aren't quite as confident with fundraising because of that. We have time for one final question today, and it's not strictly related to grant funding, but I think it's a really interesting question. And it's, do you have any advice about asking local companies or businesses for donations of goods for a particular project, even if there's no official grant form to fill in? I guess in a way you could think of this as a sort of grant, and could you give us your insights into how to best approach that?
Yes, I mean, certainly in terms of asking people, I think you said for donations of goods, so asking people for in-kind support. Will someone provide perhaps the AV equipment for the church, perhaps a video screen, or will they provide an ongoing basis that, will they provide the coffee? I think it's a very good idea and something that can absolutely be done. Most local companies would be happy to do that. If you go into a more formal approach, such as some of the grants available from some of the landfill companies, then they will have expectations about perhaps signage or how you publicize the grant. But certainly asking local companies to help out with goods and services is a very good idea. And on the services, you may well find, as in professional services, you may well find that there is a local accountant or a local law firm that is prepared to give you some pro bono support as well. So do think about the professional services support as well as the more tangible, perhaps goods and products.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. That's an interesting angle. How would you approach a business? Like, is there any particular tips or ways you'd approach them? A letter, in person?
Always in person. I mean, I don't mean turn up and knock on the door. And anyway, probably wouldn't be there at the moment because most people are working at home. But obviously, having some roots into a business, knowing somebody is useful. But look for businesses that are already involved in the local community. Look for businesses that are perhaps supporting a local sports club, or maybe a supplier locally, or maybe accessible in some other way. I've noticed that local businesses that perhaps you might not be top of mind, but are incredibly involved, can be very generous for things like prizes and support. So, for example, local food suppliers can be incredibly helpful and very happy to help out. Or you might even approach some of the local facing shops and so on of the bigger businesses. So some of the supermarkets actually can be very happy to help out, but through their local branch, not through their head office. So I think it's like all these things. You've just got to think laterally and be creative. But most, you have goodwill on your side. So most people are very happy to be asked. And of course, if you don't ask, you definitely don't get.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm afraid that's all the questions we have time for today. But thank you everyone so much for submitting your questions and for listening. I hope you picked up some useful tips from Caroline and you found her insights helpful. Just to remind you that the full recording of this will be available to watch back at any time along with the slides. And we also have more support and resources available via our fundraising hub and helpline. And that includes a list of funders who are supporting churches during COVID-19. So that's a really great place to look to start your research. And if you'd like to ask a further question, we're always happy to hear from you via our fundraising helpline. I'd now like to pass back to Richard Coleman, who's going to give us a quick close to the session.
So in closing, I just need to say a few thank yous. Firstly, thank you very much to Caroline and to Jeremy for your very, very useful insights. And secondly, thank you very much to you all for listening, participating and engaging in this webinar. I hope it's insightful and I hope it does help you in the future. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have a lot more useful material available for you, and that's all on our church fundraising hub, ecclesiastical.com/church fundraising. Also, if you do want any further help at all, we've made our church insurance consultant available under a funding helpline, and you can find details of that on our website as well. So do get in contact if there's anything else you think that we can help with. So thank you very much again for listening, engaging with us, and I wish you all the best in your fundraising activities. Goodbye for now.